evidence is the most important clue in this investigation. Each kind of evidence, of course, presents its own special problems. You will learn something about each of these subjects so that experts will tell you what can be learned from this evidence through laboratory examination.
How will the world know if the gospel is real? How will the world see? What evidence can we look to? How will the world see? Are you a child of God? Do you live like you are free? Are you walking with the Spirit? Do you care for one another? How will the world know? It's you. Your life is the proof. Your life is the evidence.
Good morning, how we doing? Happy Mother's Day to all the moms in the room, and today's kind of a special day for my family. This is the first time since January of 2020 that my whole family, with my wife and my 3 kids, have been in church together. So I'm pumped about this day, and so we're grateful that you are here with us as well, whether you're online or in person. Excited to jump back in our text in Galatians chapter 5 is where we're going to be this morning. How many of you grew up playing with Legos? All right. Probably the majority of the room. I read an article this week quite a while ago, decisions that Lego made that almost cost them the company. They became overconfident and it almost wrecked everything. And at that point, I think in over their 60-year history, they had never had a down year. It was consecutive growth for the company every single year until the late 90s and early 2000s. Things began to change for them, and in a moment, it changed. You see, during that time, late 90s, early 2000s, they saw their profits go from 86 million down to 48 million in 1 year. Like that's quite a slump for a very successful company. And so, what happened? Well, what happened is how kids played began to change. And it was during that time that technology started to grow. Legos were not being purchased as much. They weren't being as creative with their Legos. And during that down year, George Lucas, the creator of multiple Star Wars movies, actually approached Lego and said, hey, I would like to make a deal with you to make Star Wars Legos. The problem is the president didn't like movies. So he said, yeah, I'm not interested. I don't like movies, so I'm not really interested in that. And he shut it down. Well, then his grandson came to him and said, that's a bad idea to shut that idea down. And through the influence of the grandson, the grandfather then made the deal with Star Wars and then eventually like Harry Potter and eventually all the Marvel movies, which they then ended up producing Lego movies, and their profits skyrocketed like crazy, more than they ever dreamed. Why? Because of a young grandson who influenced his grandfather. The question that we want to wrestle with this morning is this: what kind of influence will you have? What kind of influence will you have? Who's had the greatest influence on you in your life? You know, we can think about all sorts of people in our life. Maybe for you, if you go back into your school age days, it was a teacher. Maybe it was a friend or a roommate. Maybe it's your spouse or your parents or your grandparents. Listen, to influence someone is to have a direct effect on their behavior. And so when I process the question of who's had the greatest influence in my life, my mind immediately only thinks of the positive. But isn't it possible that the greatest influence in your life might not be positive? It could be a negative. It might not have been good. It might actually have been bad. Listen, the influence that you give away is determined by the influence that you receive. And when we read the Bible, we learn that God is a God of influence. He's a God of influence. As creator, he was very influential in how he spoke everything into being. In creation, he imagined it and then influenced it and made it happen. And so think about the beauty of all that God has created. Think about the mountaintop views maybe you've seen in your life. Think about the sunsets at the beach. Think about the details of the human body and how much influence God had in his creativity to design it that way. Listen, you being made in the image of God is influenced by God. Like that was his idea to do that. I think of Psalm 139 when it tells us that we are knitted together in our mother's womb. Listen, God was very influential in every part of how you actually look. And so you might look in a mirror today and wish that God would have changed some things. Like for me, I'm going to be 40 this year, this fall in September. And I'm praying, fingers crossed, that by September 20, I'll grow 6 inches and be 6 foot tall. That'll be awesome for me. But the truth of the matter is, right, God was influential in making me 5'6". My brother's 5'9". Why couldn't I have been 5'9"? You know what I mean? So the truth is, God made me 5'6", and he probably gave me a big mouth. Like that was probably his part of his created order for me. Listen, whoever influences you often determines how you will influence others. And all that God is has influenced all that is. So think about this, his character. Think about his holiness and his transcendence and his eminence. Think about his sovereignty and his justice and his compassion. Think about his mercy, his kindness, his grace, and his love. All that God is has influenced all that is for our good and his glory. What kind of influence will you have? That's what we want to wrestle with this morning. And 2 observations out of Galatians 5, picking it up in verse 7. And here's the first, is that your gospel influence will be disrupted by legalism. We've talked heavily about legalism over the last many weeks. But let's jump in at verse 7 and read what it has for us today. It says this about the church of Galatia, that you were running well. Who hindered you from obeying the truth? This persuasion is not from him who calls you. A little leaven leavens the whole lump. I have confidence in the Lord that you will take no other view than mine, and the one who is troubling you will bear the penalty, whoever he is. But if I, brothers, still preach circumcision, why am I still being persecuted? In that case, the offense of the cross has been removed, and I wish those who unsettle you would emasculate themselves. Kind of a strong text we have today. And we're jumping back into Galatians 5, which is one of the most important chapters for the life of the believer. And last week we saw this, that if you know Christ, God declares you to be free. And this is not something that you can declare over yourself, but this is something that God declares over you because of his death and his resurrection. In the first part of verse 7, he says this about the church of Galatia: you were running well. You were running well. You see, the influence was clear at one point. Jesus was the motivation. The goal for them was more of him. The gospel had taken a hold of their hearts. It had shaped the decisions they were making. It had determined what they would actually do. Listen, has Jesus done the same for you? Where is Jesus' influence present in your life today? Where is Jesus' influence present? Is it possible that if there is no Jesus influence, it's possible there might not be any Jesus in your life? You see, this church started in the beginning with the relationship with the Lord, but they were all in. They were free in him. He was dictating the decisions that they were making. Why? Because they had God's approval. They were working on aligning their position in Christ with their practice for Christ. Listen, does that describe you? By the way, this is called, the theological term is sanctification. And sanctification has been defined as the art of getting used to our justification. Sanctification truly is a long spiritual walk in the same direction. That's what it is. And so the influence that is happening here, they were having on each other, they were having on one another, was because of the gospel. But then he says this in verse 7. Who hindered you from obeying the truth? Who hindered you from obeying the truth? Literally, he's saying to the church, these religious people have invaded the church. They're speaking a different gospel to you, and you're giving them an ear. Why are you giving the religious people an ear? Like, who do they think that they are? Hey, church, who do you think that they are? Hindering is this idea of stopping someone in their tracks and redirecting the decisions they make to produce a different outcome. I dated my wife for 7 years before we got married. We were high school sweethearts, and the last 2 years, I was in Pennsylvania doing school. She was here in Grand Rapids doing school, and we just talked a lot on the phone. I would take Justin Kemmer's cell phone because I didn't have one, and after 9 p.m. it was free to call, if you remember these days, and I would call her, and we would talk, and we made plans. Listen, we planned to get married. We planned to start in ministry. We planned eventually to have a family. We had all these plans, but the truth is, then the diagnosis of cancer in her life changed everything. Every plan that we had went out the window. And the truth is, it changed our priorities. It changed our focus. It changed what we need to give attention to in our life. It took away a lot from our family, from the inability to be able to have our own children. You see, Steph can no longer do what she used to do, which is do things active or running or different things that involve physical activity because her body's been through so much. You see, cancer has robbed a lot from our lives. And the truth is, many of you have experienced that with your family as well. It's painful. Listen, this church right here in Galatians 5 is being influenced by a people that they need to shut down. And here's what they're saying in essence. In essence, they're saying, listen, yeah, Jesus did all of his work, but now it's time for you to get to work so God can approve of you. By the way, this is called legalism. If you've been with us, we've defined legalism is to work in your own power, according to your own rules, in order that God might approve of you. So think about that reality. Your own power, your own rules. They're not from God. It's not God's power, it's not God's rules, it's actually your rules that you've made up that you think God should be impressed by. Listen, legalism treats the gospel as good advice, not good news. And that's a problem. Legalism it actually kills influence because legalism is about you. And so isn't it wild that our flesh actually wants a role? And our flesh will take any role it can get. And so if you're going to give it legalism, it'll be happy about that because our flesh, our sin nature, it wants us to do things in our own power to attempt to influence God about his view towards me. Here's the problem. God doesn't need you to influence him. Are you hearing that freeing statement? God does not need you to influence him. You don't live your life to influence God. You live your life in a certain way because God has influenced you. One is through an avenue of legalism. The other is through the avenue of the gospel. And so somehow this church has been convinced that there's something better than Jesus. I've been there before. Have you been there before? You see, they went from living under the umbrella of divine grace to now living under the umbrella of religion, of human achievement. And literally, it sounds something like this. If you want God's approval, you must. If you want God to accept you, then do. If you want God to be proud of you, then you must. You see, legalism puts you in the driver's seat to determine the desired outcome. Here's the problem. We can't produce the desired outcome. And so what has had the greatest influence in your life? Because Paul is making it clear that what influences you and I really matters. You see, gospel influence is so different. Gospel influence is about giving away what God's already given you. It's called good news, right? And we share good news with those who are around us, and that's then how we influence everybody around us. Here's the problem. This church is now going after worldly influence, which is about sin, and somehow they've been deceived. You see, they were living for the glory of Jesus at one point, but now they're living for the glory of themselves. And so we learn this lesson here as adults that we learned as kids, and that is this: who you surround yourself with really matters. Can I talk to the adults in the room and say that? Who you surround yourself with really matters. It really matters in your life. I mean, we're called to have a gospel influence on the world, but when you see the world influencing you more than you're influencing the world, there's a problem. When you find yourself in a position that you're becoming more like the world instead of the world becoming more like Jesus because of you, something needs to change. And he says in verse 9, a little leaven leavens the whole lump. Here's the picture. Leaven contaminates everything. And often in the Bible, the word leaven references sin. And so I guess the question is, what sin do you tolerate in your life? What sin do you tolerate? Where have you taken God's standard of what he expects and lowered the bar? Don't we often tell ourselves that our sin won't affect anything, it'll be fine, and isn't that a lie from the devil that we all know so well? But actually what it does in return is it affects every part of our life. It literally affects everything we do. It affects our motivations. It affects how we view the world. So what you watch, where you go, what you do, it affects every single part of your life. Let me just tell you this, just so we're all on the same page. Your sin can't be tamed. It needs to be killed. It needs to be killed. And so what if we stop trying to put our sin on life support? And many of us today, we love to manage our sin versus kill our sin. But there's this old gospel truth that if you're not killing your sin will be killing you. And that's exactly what verse 9 is actually saying. It affects not just you, but it affects how you interact with everybody around you. It affects the influence you actually give away. And so where does the gospel, the good news that God approves of you, that he's proud of you, that he accepts you, where does that need to take new territory in your heart today? It changes everything. Our sin changes our attitudes and it changes our motivations. But here's the flip side of it. While sin contaminates, the truth of the gospel actually purifies. And so what's going to take over your life? Is it going to be sin or is it going to be truth? Look at what he says in verse 10 with me. He says, I have confidence in the Lord that you will take no other view than mine, and the one who is troubling you will hear or bear the penalty, whoever he is. But if I, brothers, still preach circumcision, why am I still being persecuted? In that case, the offense of the cross has been removed. I wish those who unsettle you would emasculate themselves. Listen, Paul's saying this. Those who oppose Jesus are going to pay the price. And based on what we talked about last week, if you were here, we see this, that the voice that we listen to determines the influence that we receive. Isn't it interesting that the cross of Christ is a stumbling block to many? In fact, it's a stumbling block to the religious. By the way, our city's very religious. And so why is the cross a stumbling block? Listen, the cross is a stumbling block because it crushes and obliterates our religion. It shows us that we can't, and we hate that as Americans, being told no, right? Here's what the gospel's telling you. Here's what the cross tells you. It tells you that you can't do it. It actually crushes our pride. And so we then are offended by what the cross reveals, but it crushes the value of your effort. You see, the cross communicates that Jesus has accomplished for you what you could never accomplish on your own. And he says this, I wish that those who hinder you, those who unsettle you, would emasculate themselves. Notice the punctuation, the exclamation point. You see, Paul might be using his strongest language yet in this book. I wish they would mutilate themselves. I wish they would castrate themselves. He's literally saying to the religious who are elevating circumcision, that's not what we elevate today, but they're elevating circumcision. And he's like, listen, if you believe that's the way, why don't you just go all in? Just go ahead and cut it all off. Happy Mother's Day, right? He's like, listen, you are so confident. You're so confident in your religion and your doing. You're so confident in your religious rules. Then go ahead. Make the ultimate sacrifice. Here's the point. You will either mock the cross or you will celebrate the cross. But the truth is this, who influences you matters. It affects every part of your life. What kind of influence will you have? What kind of influence will you have? Listen, 2 observations that determine our influence. Listen, here's the second, is that your gospel influence will be displayed by love. Let's look at verse 13. With me. It says, for you were called to freedom, brothers. Only do not use your freedom as an opportunity for the flesh, but through love serve one another. For the whole law is fulfilled in one word: you shall love your neighbor as yourself. But if you bite and devour one another, watch out that you are not consumed by one another. He says this in verse 13, for you were called to freedom, brothers. Remember this from last week. If you know Jesus, right, freedom is God's to declare, and it's ours to embrace. It's God's to declare, it's ours to embrace. And so here's what freedom is not. And this is where we get confused. Freedom is not a license to do what you want. Freedom is not a backstage pass of permission. Rather, freedom is actually gospel empowerment. You see, gospel freedom is not legalism, it's not license. And he says that when we just read it, do not use your freedom as an opportunity for the flesh. If you were here last week, I pressed in a little bit on our Christian liberties. And I said oftentimes we use our Christian liberties as a license to abuse God's grace and God's gifts. In your freedom, don't give yourself permission that God never gives you. Don't give yourself permission that God never gives you. You see, God didn't free you so you could set your own standard of freedom. Again, if you're here last week, I said this. I said, if our Christian liberty doesn't align with the Bible, stop calling it Christian and start calling it sin. Because that's what it actually is. The gospel doesn't give you permission to abuse God's grace. But Paul is telling us this, to live in freedom. So our freedom is not to choose sin. Our freedom is to say no to sin. And so what does God expect? Listen, God expects those who are in him, those who know Christ, to live in a certain way. He wants you to do what he wants you to do. And so what does that mean? Well, there's a direct answer for you today. And here's the answer so you can all see it with your own eyes. The end of verse 13. It says this, but through love, serve one another. I don't really see rules there, do you? Through love, serve one another. That's what he wants. That's what he expects. And so Paul is literally saying, listen, you want the law? Let me give you the law in one word: love. Let me summarize the whole law for you. What's most important? Love your neighbor as yourself, it says in verse 13. And here's what's wild. Think about this for a moment. When we love with a gospel love, we disrupt what is broken in our world and we show what could be. Do you realize that love is a God idea? Do you realize that love is God designed? Do you realize that God actually had and created the vision behind the idea of love? And we know the world that we live in, it loves to hijack, right, what God creates. It loves to redefine what God has defined. Here's the truth. The world can try and continue to attempt to redefine love, but here's the problem. You can't undo the cross. You can't undo it. And it's at the cross that we see not just that love is displayed, but we see how love is defined. The cross dictates it all. And so love is very clearly putting others' needs ahead of your own. Love is you before me. We've seen in this series that love is grace and truth. Love is honest. Love is caring. Love is discerning. Where sin is dishonest, it's prideful, it's selfish. Sin is always about me, where love is always about others. Listen, do you use your freedom to put others' needs ahead of your own? That's where freedom is found, he's saying. I know, it's wild, right? Freedom is found when we put others' needs ahead of our own. And by saying that, I just revealed to myself how selfish I am. How selfish I am at times. Listen, selfishness is not a sign of freedom. Selflessness is the sign of freedom. Listen, your gospel influence is defined by love, how God defines love, you before me. Now, here's what's true. We all have many things in our life that we're interested in. If I had you take out a pen and paper right now, I don't know if you know what that is anymore, but a pen and a paper right now, and I had you write down the top 10 things you love in your life, we all would have, right, a lot of things that we would share. Like for me, like I love all sorts of things. I'm a foodie. Many of you know that. I love trying new places. I love going new places. I don't go to Applebee's. It's not because I'm better than I might be better than Applebee's, okay? Okay. I can go to the Walmart frozen food section as well, just to get the same thing, okay? But here's the thing, okay? Like I love food, right? Right? I love my wife. I love my 3 adopted children. I have hobbies. I love grilling food and smoking meat. Don't really smoke veggies. That's not really a thing. But I love doing that. Listen, this is kind of weird. You might not know this, but I love mowing the grass. I love mowing nice grass. I know, it's weird. It's just me and my headphones in that moment, right? Listen, we all have things that we love. I can also say that I love Jesus. Would that be on your list? Isn't it interesting how we talk about the things that we love? If you listed out your top 10 things that you love, hobbies, people, places, right? We talk about what we love. It's just so natural. It's just what I do. It's what you do as well. So I guess the question is, if we all agree that we talk about what we love, does Jesus ever enter the conversation? If he doesn't, do we actually love him? Do the conversations in your life ever get to your love for him? Do the relationships that you have in your life, do they influence you towards Jesus or away from Jesus? Listen, if they influence you away, it's time for new friends. It's time, even as adults. Sometimes we need to make the spiritually mature decision. Listen, I have the privilege of working with my friends here at Redemption. Most of you know that. Justin Kemmer was my college roommate. Pastor Matt was a roommate. I've known Pastor Steve since before I was 10 years old. Right? And the truth of the matter is they get to see the best of me and the worst of me. And when they get the worst of me, guess what they get to do? They get to confront me in love, in grace, and truth, and point out those things that are not aligned with the gospel. Do you have that in your life? Do you have people that'll love you in that way? Listen, here's what we've seen this morning, that legalism, moralism is actually hindering where love is actually helping. And so who you allow to speak into your life matters, because who speaks into your life is going to influence your life. And so do you have relationships that promote the freedom that Jesus declares? Because it's interesting when we surround ourselves with people who don't do what God declares, how that affects our lives. And so do those around you, they influence you in this way to remind you that you are fully known yet fully loved by the Lord? Do you remind other people around you that they are fully known yet fully loved by the Lord? Listen, if we can consider the greatest influence in our life, let me be clear with you. It's not your spouse. It's not a teacher. It wasn't your parents. It wasn't your grandparents. It was the cross. It was Jesus who is the greatest influence in our life, because it's at the cross we see what love actually is. We see that love meets us where we are in our depth of our sinfulness and our brokenness and our rejection of God and our hatred of his name. He meets us there in his love. He brings us out of that to give us a different eternal outcome and a different purpose in the now. That's a crazy love right there. That is the thing that should be influencing us the greatest. You see, the gospel is not just about you, it is also about others around you. But let me just point out in verse 15, we see what's natural when it says this. But if you bite one another and devour one another, watch out that you are not consumed by one another. Listen, what we're seeing in verse 15 is actually what's natural to us, isn't it? To bite one another and to devour one another. Remember, selfishness versus selflessness determines if there's freedom in your life. Verse 15 is the result of selfishness being true. We bite and we devour. I label this as animal-like behavior. Devouring one another is this picture of, I don't like what you're doing, so I'm going to give you my wrath. And you can experience the weight and the mess of who I am over and over and over again. Isn't it interesting how responding in the flesh is so easy for us? It's natural, isn't it? It's easy. It comes so quick. Man, just real quick. I can get hot, I can get angry, man, and in a heartbeat, it can happen. So the challenging way for us to respond is then through the Spirit in love. Listen, this is how the Spirit calls us to influence others. Notice this then, that it takes incredible intentionality to respond in the Spirit. Incredible intentionality to respond in the Spirit. Why? Because everything missionally motivated requires intentionality. Jesus didn't die for you, fingers crossed, hoping it would help. That's not why he died. He went on a rescue mission knowing that he's going all in and it's going to produce the results that he wants in your life, which then means that everything tied to gospel influence requires love. It is putting others' needs ahead of yourself. And so to influence others with the good news of the gospel is missionally motivated. Why? Because Jesus went all in so we could be free. We just get to be. Not to earn, not to gain, just to be. What a position of peace we have because of Christ. And so our gospel takeaway this morning is this, is that every part of you influences everyone around you. Listen, every single day, friends, we are influencing people with what we love most. Every single day. What influences you influences everyone. You are constantly influencing people. And by the way, you don't have a choice in the matter. You don't have a choice to determine if you're going to influence someone. The choice lies here. What kind of influence will you give away? Like, that's the tension. How will you do that? How has the gospel influenced you? I think of I think it was 1981 when Chariots of Fire came out. Many of you probably don't remember that now. That just means I'm getting a little bit older. But Eric Liddell, the runner in the movie, he said this. He says, "When I run, I feel God's pleasure." Think about that statement. I feel God's pleasure. Listen, when we live in freedom of the gospel, we experience the pleasure of God. So think about that. There's no guilt. There's no shame. There's no condemnation. We're not enslaved to moralism or legalism. But listen, it gets way better than that. That doesn't necessarily just provide the pleasure. That's really great. But notice where the pleasure comes from, that when you live in freedom, you realize you're living in access to God. You're living in such a way that you have God's approval and you have God's acceptance. And we're just free to be in that position. Living in a position of selflessness. Think about the decisions you make on a daily basis. How often are the decisions you make based on selfishness versus selflessness? So the question as we close is this: what kind of influence will you give away? What kind of influence will you give away? Your influence is giving away something. Do you know that? What do you want to determine the influence that you give away? The choice is actually yours. Because here's the biblical truth. How you want to influence others is determined by what you're intentional about right now. Right now. That means there's work to do. To be intentional takes work, right? It takes effort. You want to be intentional in a relationship with Jesus? It's going to require work. You want to be intentional to raise the flag of the gospel in your home the highest and raise high the banner of the gospel, the good news of Jesus? It's going to take crazy work, because what comes natural and easy is not those things. The Spirit requires work. We have to give effort to bring out the Spirit in our hearts and in our lives. You want your marriage to be in a place where Jesus is reigning? Listen, it's going to take incredible intentionality and humility on our end. Who are you going to influence? Well, how do I influence others in a gospel way? Let me give 3 quick bullet points, okay? Real quick, 3 quick ideas. Think about this. Think about random service. Random service. Think about actions. Ways that you can put others' needs ahead of your own. Think about selflessness. Like what if you did one selfless act this week for somebody? Just one. Here's the second one quickly. Think about regular encouragement. Think about writing a note. or words of affirmation, or sending an email or a text message. Third, respond in patience. This is really hard for me. Patience is not my thing. Anyone else with me on that? Right? Kindness. It's hard. These are things of the Spirit. These are things of the Spirit. And I wonder if we started carrying out selfless acts, if we would start realizing in that moment that what freedom actually is. Listen, friends, freedom is not perfection. But freedom is over time that there's this path of putting others ahead of myself. It's selflessness over selfishness. And so we can just gauge our heart on where those things are at. And by the way, any of these things, anything of the Spirit requires the Spirit in our life. Like, we have to be focused on Him. We have to ask for His help. We have to surrender certain things in our life. They don't come natural, but over time, guess what happens? The things of the Spirit, when He starts getting a louder voice in our life, those things become easier and easier over time. Who will you influence this week? Let's pray. Jesus, I want to thank You for Your word, and I want to thank You for the cross and how it influences us. Lord, if the cross wasn't true, we wouldn't even be here this morning. If the cross wasn't reality, Lord, we wouldn't be gathering on Mother's Day 2021 to actually worship You. That's not what we'd be doing. We'd be doing something else. And so, Lord, I'm so grateful for Your influence. I'm so grateful for Your love for us. I'm so grateful that You meet us in the depths of our brokenness, Lord, and You move and You work in a mighty way, in a way that only You can. And now we get to celebrate that reality that we are free in You. And we don't have to perform, Lord. We're free from performing, but Lord, we are free to be, to elevate selflessness over selfishness. So, Lord, I pray that Redemption Church and those who call this place home will be a church, Lord, that are going to be made up of a people who want to live selfless lives, who want to influence the world around them intentionally, Lord. And I think of why we planted this church, of connecting people to Judas for life change. Lord, I consider what we say every service, that God has you where He has you to advance the gospel through you. Listen, that's a statement of influence. And so I pray, Lord, that we will influence everybody we can for the glory of Your name and the goodness of others. In Your name, amen.